So, welcome back, everybody. This is Night Flight, and as you can see, Ralph Ellis is back. And today we are going to talk about Saul and Josephus and the Church of Saul. So, welcome.
Yes, glad to be back again. Thanks, Judith, for having me on. Yes, we're going to talk about something that the church does not talk about. The fact, and I can call it a fact, I'm sure, that the Christian church came from Saul, not from Jesus. You have to remember that Jesus was a Nazarene Jew. Um, Not one jot or tittle will be changed from the law, from Mosaic law. But of course, that's not Christianity. Everything changed with Christianity. Why? Well, because the founder of Christianity was Saul, who was preaching to the Gentiles. He had a different church. And that's what we're going to look at today. The fact that Christians are following the church of Saul, not the church of Jesus. And since the church of Saul was the enemy of Jesus, they were literally enemies of each other. Christians are following the religion of the enemy of Jesus. Yeah. That's why they don't talk about it too much in church, because it's controversial, to say the least. But Saul was a Romophile. He was the apostle to the Gentiles. And that's why his church was different. So what I'm going to do to start with is try to look at who Saul was. Now, this is not necessary to know which church was which and where Christianity came from. This is a bonus, basically, which does explain things. Because as usual, we don't know who Saul was.
Hmm.
This Saul, when I'm saying Saul, for people who might be confused, we're talking about Saint Paul. Saint Paul was called Saul. And I think Saul was his proper name. And he was given the title of Paul because Paul means small. Or in these terms, I think it means junior. So he was Saul the junior. And I think he was the junior because he was the younger of the two brothers. I think Saul and Barnabas were brothers. Barnabas was the older. He was Jupiter, as it says in the epistles. And Saul was little Mercury, the fiery little Mercury, because he had a big mouth and he knew how to use it. He was very erudite, we would say. And that's why he was very good at persuading people
Hmm.
to join his new church. So,
Um,
yes, yeah,
so, some people say that uh, Jesus was the one who changed Saul's name to Paul. But there are a number of articles out there that say no, that was not the case. Um, we have name changes with Abram to Abraham, yeah.
yes,
But this situation when
Jacob to Isaac.
Jesus talks to Saul, he addresses him as Saul. And then when was it Ananias who healed him because he lost his eyesight? Um, After that, there are at least 11 more times where Saul is addressed as Saul. And some argue that Paul was had to do with his Greek name.
Well, yes, I suppose Saul is obviously Hebrew, comes from King Saul. He
Mm.
was named after Saul. That's why I think that was probably his primary title. And I think Paul just means junior. So he was Saul
Mm.
the junior, so he wouldn't be confused with anybody else. Um, and the church likes to call him Paul, because they don't really want you searching through Acts of the Apostles and knowing he was actually Saul, because Saul is not a terribly nice character. Like Josephus, he's very much a self-centered egotist, slippery, sort of slimy sort of person, guy that was stoned all across Anatolia and Greece because they didn't like him. The guy that could talk people and to people until his audience actually fell asleep, and this guy fell out of the window because he fell asleep. Yes, he would just go on and on, rambling as Saul does. Very persuasive. This is another thing. He was more important than people make out. They try and make out he was a tent maker. Now, when he was put in jail, he was seen by the two procurators, the two governors of Judea came to see him. Festus and Felix, I think they were. They both came to see him while he was in jail. And the king and queen came to see him while he was in jail. Now, I don't know, but if I was sent to jail for some reason, I don't think the king and queen would come to see me in jail. It sort of tells us that this guy was rather more important than the church makes out. Now, one of the governors tried to get a bribe from him to get him to release him from jail. Now, that again implies that the guy was rich. So he's rich, influential. And then one of the governors also said, Saul, your great learning has driven you mad. So he was known for his erudite preaching, twisting words, twisting meanings, and so on, in order to persuade people. So he was a very good communicator. And I think that's confirmed if my assertion of who this guy was is actually true. So we don't know who Saul was. There is no Saul in the historical record. People say he was born in AD 10 and he was this guy from Tarsus and so on, became an apostle. And yet we don't know who he was. Yet he was hugely influential. I mean, he wrote most of the Bible, all of the epistles sort of thing, although some of the epistles are not regarded as true epistles. So who is this guy in the historical record? Well, I think we can find him if we compare characters to two people which tend to be rather similar. So there is another person who is very, very similar to Saul. So Saul and this person, they were both Jews, both raised in Jerusalem, both had Roman citizenship, and that was not common in Judea at the time. Both educated as Pharisees, both became rabbis, both taught against long hair. So Saul says, does nature not teach you that long hair is shameful on a man? Corinthians 11:14.
Where would nature teach us that? I don't get it.
Well, because Jesus had long hair, you see.
No, no, that is not what I mean. Be that as it may, if he had short hair or long hair, that is not so relevant to me. But
Well,
why does he say nature teaches us that long hair on a man is shameful? Why nature?
well, because he's trying to put himself above the Church of Jesus and James.
Oh,
This is
okay.
the contention between the two churches. How do you do that? Well, you differentiate yourself from the Church of Jesus and James. Now, Jesus and James were Nazarene. The Nazarene were not allowed to cut their hair. That's why the traditional Jesus always has long hair and beard and mustache, because they were Nazarene. Now, if you want a different church, you want a different style.
Mm.
And Saul was a bit of a Romophile, and the Romophiles tended to shave and cut their hair. So he had his followers all cut their hair, so they didn't have long hair, in order to differentiate themselves from the Nazarene,
That's
because there was
interesting
this big
because,
contention.
yeah, that's interesting because Jehovah's Witnesses, for instance, when you look at their publications, they show Jesus always with short hair.
Yes, that was the Roman fashion. Yes.
Hmm.
The early Roman images have Jesus with short hair, but traditionally, of course, we all know Jesus had long hair. And that makes sense because he was a Nazarene. The Nazarene didn't cut their hair. They would only ever cut their hair for a sacrifice, which would only be, once every, 10, 20 years or something. So Nazarene traditionally always had long hair, as did the Edessens. And of course, we've spoken about this before. I link Jesus to the Edessan royal family, and the Edessens all had long hair, beards, and mustaches. So there was a difference between the two. And Josephus, again, when we're talking about comparing two people, Josephus is also anti-long hair. So I'll have to read this one. It says, when any men have made a sacred vow, I mean those that are called the Nazarites, the Nazarene, that suffer their hair to grow long. The way he phrases it, that they suffer their hair to grow long, talking about the Nazarene of Jesus and James, implies that Josephus probably had short hair in the Roman fashion. And the only bust we have that is applied to Josephus has short hair, of course. So that's just one of the similarities between these two people. So they both had a flash of inspiration in different places, but they both had a flash of inspiration. They both traveled widely in Europe, both went to Rome, and particularly they both sailed to Rome on a prison ship in about the same sort of time, which was shipwrecked. So there was the great shipwreck that they talk about in Acts of the Apostles. And this shipwreck the ship was wrecked on Malta, and then they had to wait on Malta until the next year, and then they got a boat to Naples, and then they both went to see Nero in Rome. Now, how many Jews at this time, that we're talking about early AD 60s, would have been shipwrecked on a boat on Malta and taken to Naples and then go on to Rome to see Nero? It's not a very common event, and yet both of these people went to see Nero on a prison ship. And that description of this wreck is a first-hand eyewitness account. You can tell it just has all of the detail that you wouldn't necessarily know unless you had actually been there. The throwing things, all of the cargo they were throwing over the side to lighten the boat. They took the lifeboat. So these ships carried lifeboats. I didn't even know they did that. And they put the lifeboat out the back and trailed it on a rope because it was too heavy and top heavy. They put the anchors out of the front in order to stop the boat being dashed upon the rocks, because they could hear the breakers coming up front. And then the boat crashed onto the shoreline of Malta. It's a nice, gripping little story, which seems to indicate that this actually did happen. And both Saul and this other person were on a very similar ship. So who is this? Oh, and both of these people had the same publisher, Epaphroditus. So their letters and books and so on were translated and published by Epaphroditus, who may have been later on the chief scribe of Emperor Nero, who was also Epaphroditus. So who is this other guy? And I've got about, I don't know, 18, 20 similarities between these two people. who was this other guy who sounds rather like Saul? Well, the answer is Josephus Flavius. They are very, very similar characters. And when I first proposed this back in 96, long time ago now, nearly 30 years ago, everyone said it was impossible.
Mm-hmm.
The dates don't match, the people don't match. It's just simply not possible. But actually, the dates do match if you disregard what the church teaches. Now, the church will teach that Saul was born in AD 10 because he has to be a man to go around on his evangelical tours around the Mediterranean. But of course, that's not what happens. You were talking about Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, when they come around, and we have quite a lot of them in the UK as well, knocking on your door, trying to convert you, you don't get old men. You get two youngsters, because it's only the youngsters who have the time and energy to go on these evangelical tours. You cannot do it when you've got commitments and a family and children and all the rest of it. And that was the same in the first century as it is today. And so the people who go out on the evangelical tours are the youngsters. You normally get a guy in his early 20s and you get a younger person next to him, maybe his younger brother, who might be in his teens. And that's what you get. And that, I think, is what you had in the first century. So if Saul was Josephus, he was born in AD 37. Now, his first evangelical tour was in AD 52-ish. So he would have been 14-ish, maybe 15. Well, at that stage, he was a man because, of course, you have your bar mitzvah age 13 or 14. And once you've had your bar mitzvah, you are legally a man. You can get married, you can have a wife, you can have children, all the rest of it. That's just the tradition of Judaism. And so, yes, Saul would have been a man on his evangelical tours, but just a young man. And that's why he was teamed up with Barnabas, who, as I said previously, I think was his older brother. So it was older brother, younger brother, going around the Mediterranean, trying to drum up information, drum up support amongst the Jews, because initially they were preaching to the Jews of the empire, trying to convert them to Nazarene Judaism, which is not the same as Orthodox Judaism. I call Nazarene Judaism Egypto Judaism because it's different. Things like they were venerating the zodiac, which we will have a look at in a minute. I think we talked about the zodiac before, but anyway, one of their primary symbols was the zodiac. So that's something that differentiates the Nazarene from traditional Judaism. So the dates do match. And then they were both sent off to Rome on this prison ship. Saul as a prisoner, because he was accused of teachings that were incompatible with Judaism. They couldn't decide what to do with him. He was in jail for a number of years. It might have been as much as 7 years. They didn't know what to do with him because the guy was a rabble rouser. That's what they accused him of making trouble in Judea. And so they sent him to Nero to decide his case. And again, you can see that this guy was much more important than they make out. If they had a local rabble rouser in Judea, they would deal with it themselves. The last thing they would ever do is send someone like that to Nero, the most important person in the whole of the empire, to decide his case if he was a nobody. You only send someone to Nero to decide his case if he is very powerful, very important. And I think he was of the Edessan monarchy, and the Edessan monarchy was the richest monarchy in the East at this time. And that's why he was sent to Nero to decide his case. But then he came back. He had he might have had a tryst with Poppaea at the time, which, I mean, there's no great evidence for this, but Poppaea had a fancy for young men. It was well known. And Josephus at this time, Saul Josephus, was a young man. And he was pretty much a ladies' man. If you read through the works of Josephus, he's always getting in amongst the women, like he did, with Adiabene and places like that. And Nero kicked Poppaea to death in the stomach, pointedly because she was pregnant. Now, a man doesn't do that to a woman unless he suspects perhaps that the child is not his. And so you've only got a limited number of men who were around Poppaea at that time who could have been responsible. So you've got something like a 1 in 10 chance that Saul Josephus was involved in this tragic little case. But anyway, because of this, and he got loads of presents from Poppaea. This is how close he was to Poppaea. It was Poppaea who introduced him initially to Nero. So he skips Rome and runs back to Judea, perhaps because the long arm of the Romans was following him at the time. And then we get another confirmation that he might have been Saul, because now, this is in the mid-AD 60s, Josephus becomes the chief army commander in command of Galilee. And now, of course, in Acts of the Apostles, we get Saul persecuting Jesus. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Now, this is presented as a sort of reincarnated Paul, because the timeline doesn't match in the Bible, of course. Jesus was supposed to have been crucified in AD 30, and this is happening in the early in the mid-AD 60s. So the timeline doesn't match in the gospel story. However, if we jump the chronological chasm and move on these dates by 40 years, as I say should happen, all of these events took place in the AD 60s, not in the AD 20s. If we do that, then this matches. So what we have in Acts of the Apostles is Saul persecuting Jesus. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? In the works of Josephus, we have Josephus persecuting Jesus, Jesus of Gamala, chasing him all around Galilee and arresting him. Josephus, Josephus, why are you persecuting me? It's the same story. But it happened in the AD 60s. And it only works like this. You only get this conflation of events if Saul is Josephus. So the conflation of these two characters, Saul and Josephus, does work, and it is explanatory. It explains why Acts of the Apostles has this strange story about Saul persecuting Jesus. And how was Saul persecuting anyone? Traditionally, of course, Saul was just a tent maker, an artisan, a nobody with big ideas. So how was Saul going around Galilee, arresting these proto-Christians, the Church of Jesus and James, and putting them in prison and killing them? Under what authority was he arresting people and putting them in prison? The church doesn't say. But now we know, because as Josephus Flavius, he was the army commander in charge of Galilee. And he had been put there by the Jerusalem authorities because the army of Cestius had been killed, had been beaten. So this was the Roman legion of Cestius, which was beaten by the Jews in AD 66. At the beginning of the Jewish revolt, they actually defeated a Roman legion. And there was a power vacuum because the Romans had now gone. The Romans have fled. And so the Jerusalem authorities appointed 4 commanders for the different regions of Judea. And the commander in charge of Galilee was Josephus Flavius. And that's how he had the authority to arrest these people and to put them into prison. Because Saul was Josephus Flavius, and they were doing exactly the same thing. So the date of this arresting business in Acts of the Apostles must have been AD 66, perhaps AD 67. We can accurately date it because that's that's after the defeat of the Legion of Cestius and before Vespasian arrives with his big army to restore Roman rule in Judea. So that's a background information to who Saul might have been, because this is not important for who he was according to the Acts of the Apostles. But it does explain who this character might have been. And so if you bear in mind as we go through the rest of this that Saul may well have been Josephus Flavius, it does explain a great deal. And so we can go back now to what it says in the Gospels about Saul. Now, obviously, the Gospels are talking about Saul. They're not talking about Josephus, because never the two will be mentioned together, because it's very contentious, of course. The reason why in the church Saul cannot be Josephus is A, Josephus was just a horrible turncoat. Nobody wants the founder of Christianity to be Josephus Flavius. He was just an awful character. But Saul wasn't much better, I have to say. And it changes the timeline. If Saul is Josephus, then the gospel story has to have taken place in the AD 60s, with Jesus being crucified, as Josephus says, in AD 70. So it changes the timeline, and that's why nobody can agree that Saul is Josephus, because it has too many implications for the classical story of the Gospels. But it does make sense of the Gospels. All of the things that didn't make sense before suddenly start to make sense if we move the story. And there's good reason for moving the story. It explains it explains why Jesus was talking about Zacharias Baruch. Now, Zacharias Baruch died between the altar and the temple, on the Temple Mount, and Jesus laments his death. But Zacharias Baruch didn't die until about AD 68 during the Jewish revolt. And yet Jesus is lamenting his death. So there are many things like this within the New Testament which indicate a later date. We have Jesus talking about Jerusalem being surrounded by a trench and a wall. Well, that didn't happen until AD 68. That happened during the Jewish revolt. That was the Romans did that.
Yeah, could that be that he prophesied that?
It's supposed to be prophecy. They have to say it. They have to say it. Everything is a prophecy. Same with Zacharias. They have to say it's a prophecy. But what if it wasn't a prophecy? What if this is actually AD 60s? And that is why they have to say that none of the Gospels were written down. So they have Jesus crucified in AD 30. None of the Gospels were written down until the AD 70s. There was 40 years of oral transmission. Why do they say that? Because a lot of the Gospel material comes from Josephus Flavius. And Josephus didn't write his books until the AD 70s. So they have to have this 40 years of oral transmission. And yet there's no good reason for it. These were literate people, especially if Saul was on first name terms with the king and queen and the governors of Judea. It's quite obvious that Saul was a literate person. We've got all of the epistles. So why weren't the Gospels written down until the AD 70s?
Yeah, and Luke, as far as I know, he was a doctor, a physician,
Mm.
so he would probably be capable
Of
of
writing
reading
it
and
all down.
writing as well.
And Luke uses Josephus Flavius. A lot of the material in Luke comes out of the works of Josephus Flavius.
Mm.
Um, it all makes more sense if the events happened in the AD 60s and they're relating the story of the Jewish revolt. And therefore, it wouldn't be written down until AD 72, 73, because that was immediately after when the events happened. And so there is no oral transmission in my version, because everything happened in the AD 60s. And Jesus um, was crucified in AD 70, as Josephus Flavius says. Josephus Flavius has the story of him coming back from Tekoa to Jerusalem, and he sees the three leaders of the Jewish revolt being crucified in the Kidron Valley. And he thinks this is a stupid idea because a dead hostage is useless. You tend to need live hostages, otherwise, defeats the whole object. So he went to the governor and asked for them to be taken down early. He was given permission. They were taken down early. They were given medical treatment, and two of them died, but one of them survived. Familiar story? Yeah. That was the crucifixion event. And of course, the person being crucified was the king of Edessa, who started the Jewish revolt, whose name, as you'll see in my books, was King Jesus Manu, the sixth of Edessa. King Jesus Emmanuel of Judea and Edessa. So it all does fit very well if you can understand that this happened in the AD 60s. Now, to me, it makes no difference. I mean, what's the difference? AD 30s, AD 60s? Looking, from afar, that makes very little difference to the gospel story. But of course, Christians cannot agree with that, and so they have to say, no, that didn't happen. But there you go. I think it did happen. It happened in the AD 60s. So we come to, I'm going to read some.
Before you do that, I have one question.
Mm.
Um, you mentioned the Church of Jesus and James. I also found while I was reading through various ideas on this topic that some people questioned if Jesus even intended to start a new religion. So, but when you use the term the Church of Jesus and James, then that would mean yes, they did want to start a new religion.
Well, I don't think they wanted to start a new religion. I think they wanted to go back to the original religion. Now, the Nazarene were, I call them Egypto-Judaism, because remember, the
Mhm.
history I have of the Edessans is they came out of Egypt, just as the Israelites came out of Egypt. And I say, of course, if you look back on some of our previous lectures, I say that the Israelites were the Hyksos Egyptians that came out of Egypt. In fact, that's what Josephus Flavius says. He says the Hyksos Egyptians were our ancestors. So he agrees with this story that the Israelites not only came out of Egypt, but they were Egyptians themselves. Immigrant Egyptians, they had invaded Egypt and now they were being thrown back out again, but they were substantially Egyptianized. And so original Judaism was Egypto-Judaism. It was polytheistic to start with, and then, of course, we had the reforms of Pharaoh Akhenaten and Nefertiti, who made it monotheistic. And that's where Judaic monotheism comes from. Now, that is a slightly different animal to not only classical Judaism as we know it, but classical Judaism from the first century, because they had a reformation in the first century as well. Of course, before the first century, it was Judaism was centered on the temple, and it involved animal sacrifice and so on. After the first century, we have rabbinic Judaism in synagogues, and there is no animal sacrifice anymore. So they had another change in the first century. Now, I think the Church of Jesus and James wanted to go back to the original Egypto-Judaism, which is more Sabaean. Sabaean meaning star worship. Well, star worship is a very poor term, I think. They were astronomers and astrologers. They were looking to the heavens, explaining the heavens, using the heavens for divination and things of that nature, like Joseph did. Joseph was foretelling the future, no doubt using the heavens in order to do so. And we have the zodiacs, which we will look again at in a minute. So their primary symbol was the zodiac. They were Sabaeans. Now, classical Orthodox Judaism of the first century, I don't think venerated the zodiac. In fact, we have proof of that. They sent Josephus Flavius to go and destroy the zodiac. We'll have a quote from that later. So Judaism from the first century, from temple in the first century, did not venerate the zodiac and was not the same, obviously, as Nazarene Judaism. So Jesus was trying to go back to the original church, and Saul was trying to drag them off in a completely different direction into being a church for the Gentiles. And so you can see this enormous contention between these two groups. Well, in fact, at that time, there was three groups. We had the church of classical Judaism in the temple. And we had Jesus trying to take over the temple as well. He was elected as high priest in AD 62, 63-ish, which equates to Hebrews 7. If you look at Hebrews 7, it tells you why Jesus became high priest. But that takeover wasn't complete. And the Jesus character, King Esus Manu of Edessa, not only wanted to take over Jerusalem and become high priest, the priest king, in fact, he wanted to take over Rome and become the next emperor. So we could have had Emperor Jesus. We go through that in our previous talk about the Jewish revolt. But it's quite obvious that the throne of Rome was empty at this time. Nero was dead in AD 68. It was open to whoever could grab it. And they had the year of four emperors, where four people tried to become the emperor, and they were all killed by the next one who came along. And I think it was the year of five emperors, and the fifth being the King Esus Manu of Edessa, who Vespasian was fighting in Judea. And this is why, obviously, King Esus Manu lost this battle against Vespasian, against Rome. But when he was crucified wearing a purple cloak, which was the symbol of the emperor. They dressed him up as an emperor, as a pretender to the throne of Rome.
And this King Isa from Edessa, did he have Roman citizenship?
His father, who was King Abgarus, spent 7 years in Rome as a guest of Augustus because they didn't trust him. He was a newcomer to this region. And so Rome did what they normally do. They took him as a hostage for the fidelity of his people. You know, be a good lad, otherwise we kill your king. So he spent 7 years in Rome as a guest of Augustus, being hailed as the wise king because he was very knowledgeable. And finally, he proved to Augustus that he was a jolly good Roman, honestly, and he was elect to go back to Edessa to lead his people. So, yes, I would imagine that family would have had Roman citizenship.
Yeah, because I was just thinking if the Romans, you said the throne was empty, it was up for grabs. And I was just wondering if the Romans had any type of provision that no foreigner could take over the empire. You know what I mean? And
Yes,
as
well,
it is in the United States, for instance.
yes,
Mm,
they did. However, that was coming to an end because the family of Caesar was dying out.
mm,
Nero was the last Caesar. And so now it effectively was becoming open to foreigners becoming emperor. And of course, it did later on. You have all of these Syrian kings becoming emperors of Rome, all, Septimius, Severus, and so on, and all of the Syrian clans of Julia Domna, Emperor Elagabalus. They were all Syrians. So later on, of course, yes, there were many foreigners took over Rome. So yeah, they would have had Roman citizenship. I'm sure Yuba II would have had Roman citizenship. I mean, Yuba II was brought up in Rome, another of these client kings where they drag the sons off and educate them in Rome to make sure that they're good Romans before they go back to lead their provinces. And as I say, Abgar, the father of King Esus Manu, did the same. He was dragged off to Rome. They had almost a complete school of young princes over there. Augustus especially was famed for his creche, you might call it, of princesses and princes, all being held hostage by Rome, because they were all useful later. I mean, that's where Queen Theomusa Aurania came from. She was a princess who had been held by Augustus for many years, and then she was given as a diplomatic bride to the king of Persia. They were quite useful, these people. And hopefully they were loyal to Rome, having spent, 20 years in Rome, being pampered as a princess in Rome with every luxury that Rome can provide. Because that's how they did. That's how they persuaded these people. That's how they persuade people today. You get these barbarians in and you give them all the luxuries of Rome, and they see all these magnificent temples and houses and palaces in Rome and think, wow, look at all of this. How can you ever rebel against Rome? And Rome gives us so much, especially as a prince or a princess. We did exactly the same just very recently with in Northern Ireland. We were talking about Northern Ireland just a minute ago when they had the Troubles. And so what they did is they invited some of these terrorists. It's a contentious decision to do so, but you can see what they were trying to do. They invited these terrorists into Westminster, give them every luxury that not the empire this time, but Britannia can provide, and say, do you want all of these luxuries, or do you want, to be sitting in your dark dungeon with your guns playing at terrorism, or do you want all of these luxuries? And that's what they do. That's how they persuaded the Northern Irish to come to the negotiating table. So the old tricks have never changed. It's exactly the same.
mm.
And so going back to Saul, I was going to flash up this. I was going to read some gospel stories to you.
Yeah,
not,
okay.
not that people want to read gospel stories, but so is that coming up? I can't see that that's come up.
I see it.
You can see it, right? I wish it would show me a window so I can see that you can see it. Anyway, this is talking about the differences between the Church of Saul and the Church of Jesus, which was the central topic of this talk. And there were two major differences, I suppose. So this is all from Acts of the Apostles here. And Acts of the Apostles is slightly, the chronology is slightly misaligned. So it starts at the beginning, but I don't think this is actually the beginning. It says, I went again to Jerusalem with Barnabas. This is Saul speaking. Most of Acts of the Apostles, it's actually Saul speaking as I, first person. He's saying I. I went again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, who I think was his brother, and took Titus, interesting name, we don't know who Titus was, and communicated unto them that the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, he's preaching to the Gentiles, this is the big difference, but privately to them which were of reputation, so the leaders of the church. Yet Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was not compelled to be circumcised. Now, this is the big contention between the two churches. The church of Jesus and James required circumcision, whereas Saul was highly against it, and so was Josephus. And if you go back and have a look at our previous talks, this circumcision might actually mean castration, because we have the church of castration, which we talked about previously, so I won't go through it too much. But they were known as the Galli priests, who venerated Cybele and Attis. It was a big cult in Judea at the time, or in the East. And Josephus calls them Galileans. And of course, Jesus was a Galilean. So are they talking about circumcision, or are they talking about castration? Moot point. Might be another reason why Josephus was Saul and Josephus were against circumcision stroke castration. It goes on to say, those who were in conference, they had this big conference. This is the Council of Jerusalem, which is why I think this is out of place in the story. In conference said nothing to me. Contrariwise, when they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed unto me, just as the gospel of the circumcision unto Peter. Again, this is the big difference between the two churches. Peter was the head of the church of the circumcision. Saul was the head of the uncircumcision. And you can imagine this is a big, big difference between these two churches. And that was the main point, I think, main contention, that and the hair and everything else. And when James and Cephas is Peter, of course, they all have different names, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given unto me, and they gave me and Barnabas the right hands of fellowship, that we should go to the heathen, and they go to the circumcision. So this is the second tour. So on the first evangelical tour, Saul would have been preaching to the Jews of the empire, because there were many Jews scattered around the empire. Didn't get a very good reception. He was stoned more often than not. So on the second tour, Saul wants to go and preach to the Gentiles and become the apostle to the Gentiles, because he was getting a better response from the Gentiles than he was from the Jews for this new church. But of course, in order to preach to the Gentiles, he had to change this church again. So he was no longer preaching Nazarene Judaism with circumcision, with Mosaic law, with kosher. He was now preaching simple Judaism, as I call it, with no circumcision, no Mosaic law, and no kosher, which was much more palatable, of course, to the Gentiles.
Yeah, he even, I don't know where it is, but He even said that Jesus is the end of the law, and what he means by that is the Mosaic law. In other words, um, when you, the Mosaic law was so complicated and nobody could really follow it by 100%. And that meant you always stay a sinner no matter what, because you can you cannot obey the law completely. And then Jesus was the sacrifice that ended the Mosaic law. And therefore, Christians are no longer bound by the law. I'm paraphrasing here, but I definitely remember that I read that.
Yeah, that's perfectly correct. You were supposed to be blessed in faith instead of the law.
Hmm.
So faith now replaced the law, and you are no longer bound by the Old Testament, and that's the big difference with Christianity, of course.
This was the public hour. For full access of the entire interview, please join our Patreon community. Thank you.